My name is Nick. I am the founder of the Society for Esoteric and Entheogenic Knowledge, or S.E.E.K. We have channels on YouTube at Join S.E.E.K, Instagram and Facebook at Join S.E.E.K1, Seek and You Shall Find. I'm here with Adam Miezio. Adam Miezio is a psychedelic content writer with a background in mass media and a unique personal journey. Adam delves into the connection between psychedelics and mental wellness, dispelling common misconceptions, and sharing his transformative experiences at retreats from Guatemala to Austin, Texas. Thank you for being here today, Adam. I really appreciate you taking the time to speak with me.
Oh, thanks for having me, Nicholas. It's a pleasure to be here and speak with you, and I'm looking forward to it. Excited about the convo.
Me as well. Well, let me dive into it. We'll get the first question going. The Mazatec are an indigenous people of Mexico, primarily inhabiting the rugged mountain region known as the Sierra Mazateca in Oaxaca, Mexico, with smaller communities in adjacent parts of Puebla and Veracruz. Numbering around 300,000, they are renowned for their vibrant agricultural traditions and deep spiritual connection to nature. Mazatec veladas are typically understood as sacred, community-rooted mushroom ceremonies rather than generic psychedelic trips. The Mazatec tradition of Maria Sabina and other curanderos or healers is fundamentally ceremonial rather than recreational. A velada means vigil, and it often takes place at night and combines prayer, chanting, healing, divination, and community responsibility. Mushrooms are regarded as sacred beings called santos niños, or holy children, not simply psychoactive substances. So Adam, you have participated in Mazatec mushroom veladas. What distinguishes an authentic velada from the way psychedelic mushrooms are commonly used today?
I think that answer is pretty straightforward. I haven't done any other psilocybin mushroom ceremonies, formal ceremonies, outside of the Mazatec one I did up in Huautla de Jimenez, where Marina Sabina lived. So when I was there and I did the ceremony, I had no idea what to expect. I didn't know what entailed a traditional Mazatec mushroom ceremony. And so when I did it, first off, one of the more beautiful aspects about it was one-on-one. It was not in a group. It was just me and the curandera, which I thought was really pretty cool and kind of a luxury service, if you will. It was really nice. It started around dusk and went into the evening. And yeah, I think the main distinguishing factor is that maybe on a secondary level is that, well, let me say this first. It's half Mazatec and half Catholic. That's what really distinguishes a traditional Mazatec ceremony. So half of it is in the Mazatec language, and it is their indigenous rites, incantations, myths. And then the other half is Catholic. And then that's in Spanish. And so I don't know of many other ceremonies that go back and forth between two traditions, and then also between two languages as well. So half the ceremony, as I said, is in Mazatec, which is beautiful. There's singing, there's chanting, there's prayers in Mazatec. And then there's these alternate periods of when it bounces over to Catholic traditions, and it's in Spanish. So I live here in Oaxaca, Mexico. My Spanish is pretty good. I could understand most of the Spanish parts. The Mazatec, of course, I didn't understand anything. But for me personally, I preferred the Mazatec part because it sounds more exotic, maybe more mysterious. And I grew up Catholic. I'm not a practicing Catholic, but my family was Catholic by tradition. And I did go to an all-boys Catholic high school, so I was familiar with the Catholic stuff. And so on a final point, it wasn't unusual, the Catholic rites or traditions or structure of the ceremony, but I didn't particularly enjoy being on mushrooms and opening my eyes and seeing una misa, which is the word they use for an altar, with images of the Virgin Mary, statues of Jesus, a crucifix. It just isn't exactly my vibe, because it is unique and unusual, I think, for most foreigners.
Yes, it's also interesting to look back at global spiritual history, especially in North and South America, and see the syncretism that has evolved through their spiritual systems. And with the Catholic faith coming over with the conquistadors, a lot of these traditions had to adapt the Christian narrative in a way, metaphorically or symbolically, in order to persist and not be prosecuted. So they wove this Christian narrative throughout their indigenous teachings, and it is very fascinating to see how that transpires in all these spiritual systems. You had mentioned Maria Sabina. For those who are not aware, Maria Sabina, who lived 1894 to 1985, was a Mazatec curandera or medicine woman from Huautla de Jimenez in Oaxaca, who first introduced the Western world to the sacred use of psilocybin mushrooms. R. Gordon Wasson was a vice president at J.P. Morgan and an amateur ethnomycologist. On June 29th of 1955, Wasson, alongside photographer Alan Richardson, became one of the first Westerners in recorded history to consume the divine mushrooms during one of Sabina's midnight veladas. Wasson wrote about his experiences in the famous 1957 Life magazine article titled "Seeking the Magic Mushroom." This single piece of journalism jump-started the 1960s psychedelic revolution and brought massive numbers of Westerners to Sabina's small Mexican village. The influx of hippies and tourists severely commercialized a sacred Mazatec system. Believing the sanctity of the mushrooms had been violated, Sabina's community blamed her for the intrusion. Local backlash resulted in her house being burned down, and she was temporarily jailed. So speaking of Oaxaca, you had mentioned the Psychedelic Salon Oaxaca happening next Friday. What can you tell us about that event?
Yeah, so last year I started up a little community group here based on inspiration from a colleague in the psychedelic space, and it's called Psychedelic Salon. Mine here, of course, is called Psychedelic Salon Oaxaca, and it's just a local grassroots community organization. And it's a real neat, fun way to build community and bring people together and learn more about psychedelics. So I've been doing it for about a year now. I think we've had maybe 7 or 8 events, and I did a recent run from December until March, an event each month at a local library called Oaxaca Lending Library. And a couple of those events were standing room only, got like 60, 70 people. So that was really gratifying and a lot of fun, because Oaxaca, I think, if I'm not mistaken, the population of Oaxaca is around 300,000 maybe, and then with the metro area it's about 500,000. And even though that sounds big, Oaxaca is very, very community based and very small, very easy to get to know a lot of people here fast and connect social groups. So to get that kind of turnout for a local community group is it's really cool, and it's promising. And I just do it on donations. I don't ask for money. I don't charge or anything like that. I do allow donations if people want to donate, just to cover admin costs like printing flyers and promotional things and stuff like that. But it's really cool. So I'm always looking for speakers here, and people that are visiting Oaxaca are coming through to speak at the events.
Is there any notable speakers that you can mention that have been part of these events?
There's a gentleman, Max, who runs a local art gallery called Peyote People, which is very interesting because the whole gallery is devoted to the sales of peyote art that is handmade by the Huichol people up north. And it's a beautiful little gallery because everything is either yarn work or beadwork.
That's very interesting. Well, you kind of segued right into the next question for me, so I'll just keep going along. The Huichol, or westernized name, the Huichol of Mexico, center their spiritual traditions around the sacred peyote called hikuri. These annual ceremonies are deeply intertwined with their identity, acting as a portal to commune with ancestors, seek visions, and maintain balance in the universe. Before the ceremony occurs, the Huichol must undertake an annual pilgrimage on foot to Huiricuta, their most sacred desert in the San Luis Potosi. This journey is a retracing of their creation origin story. Once gathered, the peyote or hikuri is consumed during an intense all-night ritual that blends joy, tears, and deep contemplation. To the Huichol, peyote is not a recreational substance but a central source of life. They believe that consuming it allows the user to transcend into a brilliant spiritual dimension where the gods exist. The visions experienced during the ceremony serve as a major inspiration for Huichol art, dictating the complex patterns found in their yarn paintings and beadwork. So we have spoken prior about the Huichol or Huichol, these indigenous peoples of Mexico who utilize peyote and mescaline ceremonies. How did learning about the Huichol pilgrimage and peyote ceremonies reshape your understanding of indigenous spirituality?
I think the main thing that comes out of what I've learned from the Viharika and Huichol. And I should say this really quick. Viharika is the name for themselves in their own language, and Huichol is the name for that tribe of people in Spanish. So I think the distinguishing factor, and this isn't unique to the Viharika, this is something shared through many indigenous tribes and civilizations, is that, well, the word that's used in Spanish in Mexico here is cosmovision, which basically in English is worldview, is very integrated with nature. There is a complete picture of their world, not only the physical world on Earth, but spiritual worlds beyond, that's intertwined with Ikari or peyote. And one thing that I learned not long ago, which is just absolutely beautiful, something that I think is actually, I'm not sure, it's at least as sacred, if not more sacred, for the Viharika people as peyote, is the deer. Because they've survived off of hunting deer for centuries or millennia, however long it is. And the fascinating, beautiful thing that I learned is that it is believed that the sacred deer, when it travels through the desert, runs through the desert, it leaves footprints behind. And where it leaves footprints behind is where the peyote grows.
It's interesting to me, yeah, the cosmology of the Huichol includes the deer, the corn, and the peyote as kind of a triumvirate or triad, similar to the Father, Son, Holy Spirit in Christianity or other systems like Hinduism with Brahma, Vishnu, and Shiva. That's kind of their core around which the rest of their spirituality evolves from. Also, as you mentioned, when a country's English or westernized name is different from the native name, linguists call the native term an endonym and the English version an exonym. I've seen similar things, in India, they call themselves Bharat or Bharat, and we call it India. So yeah, there's this divergence between English-speaking westernized names and the indigenous or local names to the countries.
I did not know that. That's awesome. Thanks for teaching me that. So it's an endonym and an exonym. Some of those are easier to say in Spanish than others, so I kind of go back and forth. It's like, well, the word for mushroom in Nahuatl. Oh my God, good luck pronouncing that. Like Tionacatl or something like that.
Tionacatl, as close as I can get. That's very interesting. Well, keeping on the thread of peyote, Quanah Parker, the last principal chief of the Comanche, was a foundational leader in the formation of the Native American Church. He championed the sacramental use of peyote, integrating indigenous traditions with Christian elements. We spoke of syncretism earlier, to help his people navigate cultural survival and adapt to reservation life. Parker learned about peyote in the late 19th century, largely through his interactions with other tribes and Mexican healers. He viewed the cactus as a sacred medicine and a gift to indigenous people. Parker established and popularized the half-moon peyote ceremony, named for the crescent-shaped earthen altar constructed inside the ceremonial teepee. He famously bridged two distinct worldviews, emphasizing that while white men discussed Jesus in church, Native Americans spoke to Jesus in the teepee. The ceremonies were characterized by all-night prayer, singing, and water rites. Facing persecution from government officials who sought to ban the practice, Parker staunchly defended peyote as a health restorer and a fundamental religious rite. His efforts paved the way for the church to incorporate and legally protect its ceremonies. So yeah, we talked about Quanah Parker in the book Empire of the Summer Moon, which suggests that you're interested in peyote's historical and political context. What did you find most fascinating in the book, and what do you think people often misunderstand most about that part of history?
Wow, that's a great question. Well, I think maybe not misunderstanding so much, but maybe a gap in our historical knowledge that we just don't learn about, whether it's in school or outside of school, and that's Quanah Parker. When I used to live in Austin, Texas, I lived there for 6 years, and when I found out about Empire of the Summer Moon, 50-year history between roughly 1850 and 1900, or 1840 and 1890 in Texas, especially in Central and West Texas, I was like, oh man, this is a fascinating little piece of history that I know nothing about. And so everyone knows and realizes the book is about the Comanches. And at that time, the Comanches were the last surviving Native American tribe in the United States. And they still held vast sway, power, and influence over most of Texas. And Quanah Parker is even though most of us don't know who he is, a very famous individual in American history because he was the last surviving Comanche chief. And well, eventually, he was defeated by the Texas Rangers thanks to the what was it, the Colt or the Smith and Wesson revolver. That was what turned the tide. However, he's so fascinating because he was able to create syncretism or hold that liminal space between worlds for years, if not decades, because he brought forward Native American traditions and myths and beliefs into the quote unquote modern American Caucasian world. And by somewhat integrating himself into American culture, he was able to keep those Native American and Comanche beliefs alive, and then also assimilate, if you will, peyote into that culture that he created. And he's kind of, more or less credited with introducing peyote to the Western world. And there's this story that sometime in the 1880s, 1890s, he suffered an abdominal wound. Not sure what happened. There's, I think, two different stories. One was that maybe he was shot. Another one is that he was gored by a bull. But he had some kind of stomach wound and somehow met a curandera from Mexico. And the curandera introduced peyote to him, and he ended up surviving his wound thanks to the peyote, and then the rest of the story is history.
Thank you for sharing that. Yeah, and it's an interesting point in history with peyote. In the late 1800s especially, Ernst Spoth was an Austrian chemist. He first successfully synthesized mescaline in 1919. Prior to this, the psychoactive compound was isolated in 1897 from Lophophora williamsii, the scientific name for the peyote cactus, by German pharmacologist Arthur Hefter. Other figures like Dr. Louis Lewin, James Mooney, Dr. J.R. Briggs, who also had a role in bringing knowledge of peyote from obscurity almost into the Western mind. So I think Quanah Parker kind of capitalized on this knowledge being more widespread, and he definitely had a formative role in the West's understanding of the education surrounding the sacrament. So I think we owe a lot to him. I also found fascinating the story of his mother, Cynthia Ann, who was kidnapped in the book. It describes. Right. She was taken by the Comanche early in her years, and from that point she grew up. She had children. Quanah Parker was one of her children. She was later taken back to the Western world, I think during that revolution that you had mentioned. And at that time, she got severely depressed. All she wanted was to go back to the Comanche life and be with her children. So it's a very interesting part of history.
Yeah, it's a wild, wild moment in history, especially Texas history, because, well, one of the reasons it was absolutely brutal on both sides, the violence that was committed by both sides. And then, yeah, I think it's hard to understand now, but for that time, Quanah was he was a superstar. He went on to, I think, attend a parade with Teddy Roosevelt in front of the White House or in Washington, D.C. I mean, Quanah became a superstar and actually made a lot of money from cattle ranching, and owned a house up in Oklahoma on a reservation, and wore suits and dressed like a Westerner eventually. So it just, yeah, a really, really fascinating story.
And that also ties directly into just the legalization efforts surrounding entheogenic sacraments in general, with the constant fight of the Native American Church to get the peyote sacrament institutionalized in the constitutional rights of the organization as a religious sacrament, entheogenic medicine. And I think a lot of their efforts rippled outward into other aspects of psychedelic history. So they are definitely a formative movement in global psychedelic history.
Yeah, absolutely. They were definitely the trailblazers. And, another little thing I think is mentioned in Empire of the Summer Moon is that, with Quanah's introduction of peyote into Native American religious rites and rituals, that then spread to Canada and helped create the Native American Church in Canada. And that's, I don't know, when did that kick off? 1910s, 1920s, something like that officially. And so, yeah, in a way, it can all be traced back to the efforts of Quanah. And he definitely didn't, I don't think he had that vision in mind. He was just trying to help his people at that time. I don't think he was thinking about creating a church, but he did in the end.
I think some of the most influential and impactful members of psychedelic history started with small goals, started with regional goals, and their effects kind of ripple outward, like I was saying, and really affect the wider movement as a whole. So fascinating figure. I'm glad you shared that book with me, and Thank you again for recommending it.
And one little quick thing, the main town, maybe even a village might be a better word in Mexico for kind of peyote culture, where the Huichol people go, is Real de Catorce. It's Real de Catorce is an old Spanish mining town, colonial town, 300-400 years old, whatever. And it's a beautiful, beautiful mountain town village, if anybody can go visit. And there's a peyote museum there. And when I went there, there's a whole bunch of pictures of Quanah Parker in the museum, which is really interesting to see because, obviously Quanah isn't Mexican, but they document his contributions to peyote, legends and traditions here in the museum in Mexico.
I think my first introduction to him was the Psychedelic Encyclopedia by Peter Stafford, but I also shared with you there's a visionary artist up in Oregon named Timothy White, and he painted a portrait of Quanah Parker that I have hanging, and every time I pass it, I think of the Native American church, the history that you're speaking about, and it is very fascinating. It's a very pivotal point in psychedelic history.
Absolutely.
Pivoting from peyote to other entheogenic sacraments, the Bufo toad refers to the Sonoran desert toad, which naturally secretes the potent psychedelic 5-MeO-DMT from its skin glands. Often smoked in ceremonial settings, the substance induces an intense, rapid ego dissolution that lasts 15 to 30 minutes. The Bufo, or Colorado River toad, is native to the Sonoran Desert, spanning parts of the southwestern U.S. and northern Mexico. As a defense mechanism, its parotid gland secretes a milky venom containing highly concentrated 5-MeO-DMT, alongside other compounds like bufotenin. Users frequently describe an overwhelming absence of sensory reality and ego death rather than visual hallucinations, followed by an afterglow period that is being researched for its potential to alleviate treatment-resistant depression and anxiety. So you mentioned your experiences with the Bufo toad. What stood out to you most about 5-MeO-DMT as an experience, and what do you think people need to understand before they want to explore toad medicine themselves?
Okay, so yeah, I think, well, first of all, my experience with Bufo was, it's ineffable. It's impossible to put into words, but your reality, your concept of Earth, you, I, me, us, whatever all this is just totally vaporized. I mean, it's totally gone. You're shot out into hyperspace, into some kind of, dimension of pure consciousness, and they have no idea what's going on with who you are, your body, Earth, like that's all just blasted, gone. So there's that. So that said, it's something to not be taken lightly. It's very, very serious, potent medicine, psychedelic that is not for the faint of heart. I did it, what about, like 5 years ago now? Also here in Mexico, in Tulum. I've been using psychedelics since I was 18 for a long time. So, I wasn't coming into it as inexperienced or anything like that. And the good sign for me was that it found me. I always think of, there's a great Hunter Thompson line, which he wrote in a letter to a friend saying, you don't find LSD, LSD finds you when it thinks you're ready. And so this happens, at least for me, and it does for other people as well, semi-often, when psychedelics find you, when you don't even try looking for them. That's also happened to me with ayahuasca. So when Bufo found me, I said, oh, this is a good sign. I ended up doing it at a place in Tulum that actually doesn't have the best reputation, but I had my ceremony was fine, no problems. I was in a teepee in the jungle for an hour and did it, and had mind-blowing experience of mystical ecstasy. And that wasn't even the hardest, most mind-blowing part of it. It was what came after, which was the most shocking, I would say.
Can you elaborate what came after and how the integration process that followed may be described so that other people who may want to explore this medicine can be prepared?
Yeah, so when I was younger, years ago, integration existed, but there's very little talk of it. I think, in the 90s, early 2000s, nobody knew what integration was for the most part. Some people did, but probably more professionals in the psychedelic space, not so much in the psychedelic underground culture at large. And so Bufo definitely taught me the importance of integration, because I had, a few years later, after smoking the toad, I had written a series of articles for Psychedelics Today for their vital psychedelic therapy training program. And one of the pieces I wrote was about spiritual emergence and spiritual emergency. And I didn't know about those things prior. And it was a really interesting topic, fascinating topic to learn about, because that's what I had while integrating after smoking the toad. I had something in between a spiritual emergence and a spiritual emergency for around the next 6 months. What happened was I, let's say, enjoyed, in air quotes, a prolonged mystical experience that involved a sequence or a chain of synchronicities. And so one of the symptoms of a spiritual emergence or a spiritual emergency is a psychic opening. And one of the symptoms or proofs of having a psychic opening are synchronicities. And I've had synchronicities for a long time throughout my life. Many years ago, I read the Carl Jung book about synchronicities, well familiar and knowledgeable about synchronicities, and had some prior to smoking the toad, and not like seeing, 1111 on your clock, like stronger ones than that. But what happened in the wake of smoking the toad was just, on a different level. So the first one I had was, I was at a restaurant in a small Spanish colonial town in the Yucatan called Valladolid. And I ended up talking with the owner of the restaurant there, and he eventually broke into English. And so we're talking in English. He asked me where I was from. I said I'm originally from Chicago. And he said, "Oh, really? I used to live in Chicago. I lived there for 12 or 13 years. I said, "Oh, wow, cool." And I said, "What did you do there?" And he said, "Oh, I taught." And I said, "Oh, really? Where'd you teach at?" And he said, "Oh, I taught at Wilbur Wright Junior College." And I was like, whoa, 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 whoa. I probably looked like I just saw a ghost. Wilbur Wright Junior College is where I got my associate's degree, and was probably about less than a mile from where I was born and raised in Chicago at my parents' house. And that is not supposed to happen. The odds of that are ridiculous, which I eventually used AI to calculate, because I think the distance between Valladolid, Mexico and Chicago, I think it's like 2,000 miles or more. And so I put in the prompts into AI. I think it was ChatGPT. I did a very extensive, specific list of prompts, and it calculated that synchronicity as being one in between 10 to 15 billion with a B. And just so people know, the odds of winning a lottery, like, I forgot what the big ones are in the United States now, Powerball, something like that. The odds of winning a Powerball is like 1 in 3 or 400 million. So think about that. Like, when you have a synchronicity that's one in between 10 to 15 billion, that's nearly incomprehensible, unfathomable, and, like I say, beyond lottery winning odds. And I had 5 or 6 of those happen throughout Mexico over the next 6 months. So it was a heck of a mystical experience. And I think a lot of the reason why that happened is the setting. Well, also the set too, because I think it's like a yin and yang thing. I was backpacking across Mexico. It was in 2021 during the pandemic, and I spent a ton of time outside in nature, going through all these beautiful natural environments in Mexico, mountains, jungles, deserts, swamps, beaches, just spending all that time outside and just having the freedom and the mental room to just kind of think and just flow, made that happen. And because I was scared for a while, because, it was kind of almost like a Robert Anton Wilson thing, entering Chapel Perilous, freaking out about why do these things keep happening to me all the time? And as they kept on happening to me, I said to myself, oh, wait a minute, they're not happening to me, they're happening for me. And then I said, as they kept on happening, I said, wait a minute, they're not happening for me either, because the subject-object relationship collapsed because things became non-dual. And I realized at the end, they're happening with me. It's the old Rumi line, you're not a drop in the ocean, your entire ocean in a drop.
Beautifully said. And in regards to the synchronicity, it's interesting because I've had other interviews with Dana Beal and Leonora Russell. They both are frontiers in the psychedelic space, and they both also describe these incredibly synchronistic moments that only happened or came about after their ingestion of these entheogenic sacraments and the period of integration thereafter. I also think it's interesting you bring about this difficult mystical inheritance that comes after consuming these sacred substances. Manly P. Hall He's a Canadian mystic and author, lecturer. He has a quote that says, "They wander in darkness seeking light, failing to realize that the light is at the heart of the darkness." And you mentioned Rumi. Rumi is often paraphrased, "What you seek is seeking you." So I think that's fascinating. It's also interesting to me that this Bufo toad, most of these other sacraments have this cosmological container or a ritual initiatic framework, this lineage of wisdom that surrounds their use. But Bufo toad seems to be relatively new in terms of people finding out that it contains this 5-MeO-DMT. There's not this indigenous heritage. Similar to maybe LSD, you could bring up the Kaikion of the Eleusinian mysteries and how it may have contained ergot, this claviceps purpurea that may have lysergic alkaloids, or morning glory seeds with LSA, which may be consumed in a similar fashion or have a similar chemical structure. But it is fascinating. What do you think about the importance of having this cosmological container or not having this cosmological container in regards to the experience?
Before that, I saw that post of yours today on Facebook with the Manly Hall quote. I always love some Manly Hall. And also, high five, kudos for including that little quote from H.P. Lovecraft. I'm a big H.P. Lovecraft fan, so that was cool to see that. In terms of Bufo, you're absolutely correct. That's an interesting thing. I've read online that supposedly there were maybe some indigenous civilizations and tribes that used Bufo, like maybe the Aztecs or the Aztecs or the Olmecs, maybe the Maya too. But I think the proof and evidence of that is probably sketchy at best. As far as we know, Bufo, I think, was discovered in, the early 1980s by an American guy living in a van by himself in West Texas. What was his name? Ken Wilson, maybe? He wrote this underground pamphlet. It was like a booklet, like a 30 or 40-page booklet, because he discovered Bufo by himself and then he smoked it by himself. And oh man, could you imagine? I forgot, it was like how many months or maybe a year or something that he lived out in West Texas and discovered the toad and then released this underground booklet about it. And then that's what basically introduced it to the world, not just the Western world, but the world itself. So yeah, Bufo does not really have any indigenous ceremonial framework around it. We kind of have to create it ourselves. And I would say it's rather important to do that. And I think there's only a few kind of more well-known psychedelics that I've yet to try. One of them is Iboga. And to me, I think Iboga and Bufo are the strongest psychedelics in the world because they're going to take you to some places that you might need some esoteric or Gnostic wisdom and framework behind to be able to integrate and make sense of what's happening after that psychedelic experience. Because like I said, it's not, at least with me, it wasn't the experience, just the experience itself, the 15 minutes of being under the influence of Bufo. It was what happened afterwards, that impacted me, much harder. Because, I thought I was going to go to an emergency room and need psychiatric care or something because of all these synchronicities happening. So yeah, I think it's very important to develop some kind of esoteric Gnostic framework around Bufo to be able to support those types of experiences, not only during the ceremony, but then afterwards.
I'm very glad you brought that up. This dual nature of the esoteric and the entheogenic, our organization's namesake, Society for Esoteric and Entheogenic Knowledge. For those who don't know, esoteric comes from the Greek esoterikos and means inner, as in the knowledge reserved for the inner circle. Can refer to practices like Gnosticism, Hermeticism, Neoplatonism, alchemy, Kabbalah, as well as Eastern systems, Hinduism, Buddhism, esoteric facets of those mystical traditions. On the entheogenic side, that word also comes from Greek roots. Entheogen means generating the divine within and refers to visionary plant sacraments throughout global spiritual history that enable one to commune with God, so to speak. So most people think of these topics as separate things, but a lot of these frameworks have overlaps, especially in initiation. You see this pattern of dissolution, reconfiguration, and transcendence. The hero's journey, as described in the 1949 book, The Hero with a Thousand Faces by Joseph Campbell. But there's so much overlap in regards to how to integrate these experiences properly, how to see the metaphorical, symbolic, allegorical, mythical narratives that underlie the experience. So I really appreciate you tying this together.
Yeah. And I love what you're doing with S.E.E.K because this kind of wisdom, knowledge, and teaching is hugely important. It used to be more I don't know if the right word is prevalent, but it was around more 20, 30 years ago in psychedelic subculture. But a lot of it today has been overshadowed by psychedelic therapy and trauma work and things like this, which isn't bad. And I don't want to take that away from anyone, but that's overshadowing a lot of the other uses of psychedelics. I say psychedelics are like a Swiss Army knife, choose your tool. And I'm not sure if it was the same Facebook post you shared, but you were kind of talking about, a mystic maybe goes to the mountains, a shaman goes to the desert, and you're usually alone. And, like, I'm not saying I'm a shaman, I'm not saying I'm a mystic. However, I was backpacking through Mexico after smoking the toad for 6 months alone, in deserts, mountains, swamps, forests, jungles. So there's something to be said about that when you do have time to kind of exit the matrix, spend a lot of time in nature alone. Things happen. And especially in a beautiful country like Mexico, every country in the world is beautiful. And I think some are just got a little something more than others. So Mexico is a wonderful, beautiful, amazing, mystical country, just on the nature alone.
Well, I surely think you're more of a shaman than many for having the experiences that you've had, having these individual times for contemplation. A lot of people don't have the bravery to endure these experiences in a solitary way. They're constantly seeking group validation or some kind of hierarchical structure to feed them the knowledge instead of searching it out for themselves. So I do commend you there.
And it's not for the faint of heart, man. It's not always easy. It's the how does the old Joseph Campbell line go? The psychotic drowns in the same waters that the mystic swims in with delight, something like that.
Carl Jung also talks about this individuation process and how most people are afraid of this unconscious shadow self. But there's, like the Manly Hall quote I mentioned earlier, there's so much that can be pulled from this subconscious realm that can really impact our conscious reality. And instead of fearing the shadow, the dark, instead we should embrace it and really try to pull back all the puzzle pieces and keys that we can from this sacred underbelly, so to speak.
Yeah. And an interesting little point on that is I've lived in Mexico for 2.5 years, approaching 3 years, and there's a side of Mexico I think a lot of people don't know or aren't familiar with, because let's face it, a lot of travelers don't go to real Mexico. They stay in resort towns, Cancun, Acapulco, Puerto Vallarta, Cabo, wherever. Mexico is a very, very esoteric country. When you start getting into the backwoods and backwaters of Mexico, there's a whole side of Mexico that Catholic Mexico hates. And a lot of that esoteric side of Mexico comes from ancient indigenous traditions and mythology. And hey, let's face it and not ignore it. The Mayans and the Aztecs were practicing human sacrifice. So there's a dark, underside or underbelly to Mexico. And I've heard a lot of wild things here in terms of spiritual, esoteric work, maybe psychedelic work in terms of confronting that darkness. I mean, there's some maybe unwelcoming, you could say, mojo and juju in Mexico around things that have happened here millennia ago. And sometimes you might have to confront those things. I ran into or met some young Mexican guys here once, and they said they had done, I can't remember, I think it was mushrooms down in the jungle in the Yucatan once, and they claimed to have seen a giant snake, maybe like a python, that chased them out of a cenote in the jungle, and they immediately ran out of the jungle and jumped in their car and left. And I tend to take that stuff more seriously than not. We tend to think in the Western world, and especially in the United States, like, oh, that stuff's all ridiculous and a joke. But when you come to Mexico and you start talking with people here, they don't treat things like that lightly.
That's another important point. There's constantly been this tension across global spiritual history of the esoteric versus the exoteric, the orthodox versus the occult. These traditions that are able to bring one into direct contact or union with this divine source through contemplative philosophy or initiatic ritual. And it opposes this hierarchical, institutional, religious structure that wants to create a system that is kind of a funnel down of truth from this one source. And you kind of get the truth as it's distilled through these different layers in the receiving end at the very bottom. But that initiatic framework or mysticism in general tries to circumvent that and really put one as the experiencer of this divine communion. And I think it's important to realize that tension and see how it plays out in Mexico and other places across Europe.
Yeah,
across the
and
world.
to your point, Mexico is very yin yang because you have this collision of Catholicism and esotericism. And so you're constantly, in that liminal space between both those worlds. And, the Catholic half of Mexico hates the other half and thinks it's most of it is witchcraft. So yeah, there's very, very interesting layers to Mexico and the spirituality here. And like you said, that's the one thing, that's the main emphasis or goal maybe of Catholicism, is to route your spirituality through the church, and that your connection to God comes through a priest or going to church, where most Gnostic esoteric traditions believe that you can connect with, source, God, the universe, consciousness on your own on an individual basis.
And the esoteric systems, from Gnosticism onto Rosicrucianism onto Freemasonry, there's always been this kind of tension between the Orthodox institution of Christianity and this more esoteric interpretation, for exactly the reason you're saying, that there's this dichotomy between experiencing the divine for the self and receiving an experience of the divine from others. That seems to create tension, bloodshed, warfare, persecution across the historical record.
I was just going to say Mexico is just a great example of that. Probably one of the better examples in the world.
Thank you. Moving from North to South America, ayahuasca ceremonies in South America involve traditional overnight shamanic rituals using an Amazonian plant brew. Centers in Peru, Colombia, and Brazil offer immersive retreats ranging from 3 to 10 plus days, featuring pre-ceremony medical screenings, guided plant medicine consumption, and post-retreat integration. Prices typically range from $700 to over $3,000, depending on location and duration. Indigenous groups across the Amazon use ayahuasca as a sacred sacrament, brewed from a combination of the Banisteriopsis caapi vine and leaves containing DMT like Psychotria viridis. It functions as a plant teacher in shamanic practices to diagnose illness, connect with the spiritual realm, and maintain social cohesion. So what drew you to work with ayahuasca, and did you find what you were looking for?
Yeah, I'd known about ayahuasca since, probably the early 2000s. And, over 20 years ago now, it sounded like this, or at least seemed to me like some very exotic, mysterious thing, psychedelic compound, medicine, drug from, an unknown world. And then, obviously over the past couple of decades, it started touching and, kind of entering the Western world more and more. And then, through a chain of synchronicities, it found me when I was living in Austin. I have a close friend that I met in Austin who used to be in the float tank business, sensory deprivation tank business. And I used to go to his float center. And I love floating. That's another great modality or method for consciousness expansion or consciousness exploration. And he happens to be an ayahuasca shaman. So I met him at it was like a conscious community event in Austin, and we were talking, and I said, oh, hey, I'm a customer at your float tank center. One thing led to the next. We started talking about psychedelics. I mentioned ayahuasca, and his next reply was, oh, I can do that for you. And so I attended a talk of his, a meetup, and at the meetup, he announced a retreat in Guatemala. And so I went to the ayahuasca retreat in Guatemala. That was 2018, and I absolutely loved it. It, I would say, is more on the maybe underground side because it didn't have much of a medical screening beforehand to speak of. There was an intake form. There was like a half-hour screening by video call with the shamans. You did have to be forthcoming about if you took any medications, any heart medications, any mental health medications, SSRIs, things like that. There was no medical staff on hand that I know of at the retreat center. I mean, I was there for a week and did 4 ceremonies within a week. I don't know what I was looking for. For lack of a better term, I'm a seeker. I'm curious. Like, one of my biggest traits is curiosity. And I just always want to see it's the Fox Mulder line. The truth is out there. And so I'm constantly on that chase. So I don't know what I was exactly looking for in terms of ayahuasca, but I certainly found something, because they were some of the most impactful psychedelic journeys I've had in my life. But then again, or I should say, and following afterwards, the integration was amazing. And you're kind of also, integrating during that week of 4 ceremonies. And I should also add that I was doing a dieta. Now, without going into the whole can of worms or opening the can of worms about dietas, I wasn't dieting on a plant or a tree, which is common in Peruvian and South American plant medicine lineages, but I was doing a dieta in terms of food and diet. So I was eating all white food, nothing preserved, no preservatives, no chemicals, no additives, and no salt. I had no salt for a week. So, and no caffeine, like nothing. And this really, really changes your body. And then because of that, it changes the way that ayahuasca affects you. So you're kind of living in this whole different, not just a lifestyle, but a physical way of being that anyone in the West is not used to. We don't live like this. And so there was a point during the week, during the day, when I just felt one with nature. I was in Lake Atitlan. A lot of people are familiar with Lake Atitlan now. It's a big psychedelic capital in Guatemala. It's this beautiful caldera. It's an extinct, defunct volcano that collapsed, and there was a lake that formed. That's an interesting story, because there was a landslide that cut off the river, and the Mayan Atlantis is underneath Lake Atitlan. Anyways, I was at this retreat right on the lake. I was looking out. I was on the veranda one day looking out at the lake, and the wind was, there was a nice, beautiful breeze, and I just all of a sudden realized, wow, I'm one with nature. Like, I didn't feel separate from it. I felt totally just in rhythm and in flow with nature itself. And yeah, it's something I'll never, ever forget.
Richard Evan Schultes talks about his ayahuasca experiences. He said that he brought a associate down with him one time. He had done it 16 times prior, and he said he never threw up, and his associate had, purged in that way physically. And he was kind of giving him a hard time, saying that it's all mental. You can circumvent the purge if you have this strong mindset. But did you have that experience where you had a physical purge, or was that a typical common thing that happened with the people around you?
Yes, common, yes. So people know the purging. It could be either vomiting or explosive volcanic diarrhea. And, there's some reasons for that. Maybe the more common reason people say and believe is that you're physically purging toxins and all this horrible food that we eat in the West and feed our bodies and things like that. And then, from the esoteric side, this could be bad juju, bad mojo, bad spiritual energy, trauma, things like this, or maybe even potentially like little demons and things like this. So yeah, I've gone through that. Interestingly enough, I've never vomited. There will be people in ceremonies around me, filling their buckets, next to me, and I'll be hearing that all night. Thank God I've never vomited. Of course, who likes that? But I've gone to the bathroom any number of times. However, I've done 7, I think, ceremonies in total. I think at least 3 or 4 of those, I've had 0 purging. And when I have nights that I'm not purging, I am having fun. I'm usually having an experience of mystical ecstasy, and I'm laughing, I'm dancing, I'm moving around, I'm shaking, I'm shimmying, I'm having a blast. But the nights that I have to spend time in a bathroom, those are not fun. And just an interesting little point about this is that during a ceremony in Guatemala on Lake Atitlan, this whole lake is ringed by, I think there's like 7 volcanoes or something like that. I heard a volcano rumble during a ceremony, and wow, that's a heck of an experience. I never heard a volcano rumble before. And when I heard that under the influence of ayahuasca, you suddenly, instantly realize, wow, why all these ancient civilizations offered sacrifices to volcanoes and respected them and revered them to the max.
Yeah, that's very important. I feel like it really puts you in touch with nature and how powerful nature is, and that we are a facet of nature. We are not the controller or dictator of the nature around us, which seems to be a very westernized idea with corporations and pollution and everything that we could go into that tangent. You had also mentioned the purging. I think it's important to reinforce the dieta as a facet of how to prevent that This fasting, spiritual fasting, shamanic fasting tends to be a running theme throughout global entheogenic history. So I think that's very important to emphasize for people that may not know about that part of the experience. Also, you mentioned the float tank. That's an integral part of psychedelic history as well. John C. Lilly was the inventor of the float tank. He also did experiments with dolphins and LSD and trying to have trans-species communication. He has interesting books, Programming and Metaprogramming and the Human Biocomputer, The Center of the Cyclone, and others. But he was a very fascinating figure. I'm glad you brought up the sensory deprivation tanks. I think that's a very interesting facet.
Yeah, and one little quick point on that. I would highly, highly recommend for everyone to try floating once. And while I was living in Austin, it became quite popular around the United States for the elderly people. Elderly people love it. And very frequently, very often, a lot of people are able to have a psychedelic experience in a float tank. Now, I've never had a psychedelic experience in a float tank. However, I will say this, I've used it for integrating after psychedelic experiences, and it's amazing for that. So if anybody has not tried a float tank as an integration tool, also very, very highly recommended because it's like meditation on steroids.
I've tried a float tank as well, and I thought it was amazing to see my imagination be able to just run wild, and it brings kind of your subconscious, unconscious to your conscious realm. There's a movie also called Altered States. It's kind of a dramatized story about John C. Lilly, about a scientist that has these entheogenic experiences within a float tank and trying to bring them back and systematize the thoughts surrounding them. So if you haven't seen the movie Altered States, I also recommend. It's wild. It kind of takes it on tangents that maybe aren't the most beneficial for the psychedelic community towards the end, but I still think it's
Nicholas, you got to warn people, don't watch that movie before going into a float tank.
Yes, maybe after your journey, go watch that movie. Moving on, the line between sacred medicine and a therapy tool largely depends on context, intent, and worldview. Traditional rituals view the substances as spirits requiring reverence, whereas clinical or modern therapeutic settings strip away dogma to treat psychological conditions. Understanding this distinction requires looking at how traditional practices differ from modern psychedelic integration. In indigenous systems, these entheogens are viewed as conscious living teachers. Healing involves aligning oneself with the universe rather than a fixed, diagnosed clinical problem. In the psychedelic renaissance, these substances are isolated to their chemical compounds and used as adjuncts to psychotherapy to treat issues like treatment-resistant depression, addiction, and PTSD. The rapid globalization of these practices has created a hybrid space. For example, many retreats in the Americas combine shamanic chanting or the sacred medicine approach with psychological integration counseling or the therapy tool approach. Across mushroom veladas, peyote ceremonies, ayahuasca experiences, and Bufo work, what do you think all these sacraments indicate about what the users are actually seeking with these experiences?
This is a big convo, kind of like two main parts to this. The first part of this is talking about the therapeutic clinical model. On an individual basis, I'm totally pro psychedelic therapy. Access for everyone that needs it or wants it should have access to it. I think it's wonderful. I think it helps a lot of people. And we definitely need it. And I just learned, I think it was last week, there were some articles that were circulating around on the internet that mental health problems have doubled across the world since 1990. So that's a big problem, because evidently the systems that we've created to live in are creating the mental health problems. And to a certain extent, it's just increased just by the number, the global population increasing. But there are other reasons that mental health problems are increasing. So there's a little bit of a danger with the therapeutic clinical model, because you can look back to like the 2010s and how corporate America started co-opting yoga and meditation and offering it during lunch and breaks at work and at offices. And there's kind of a little subversive message here, is that, okay, well, for somebody to feel better at work, to be more productive, and to be a better worker, you need to meditate and you need to do yoga and things like this. And well, the dangerous kind of message of that is that you are the problem. you are maladjusted to the system and you're not a decent, good, quality human being because you don't fit in this system well. So it deflects the attention away from the system and diverts it back onto the shoulders of the individual. And so I think there's a risk of that happening with psychedelic therapy as well. That, the onus of the problems in the world are again put back onto the shoulders of the individual instead of punching up and looking at the systems that are causing the mental health problems in the first place. Because, in the end, psychedelic therapy is a reactive solution to a very, very big problem. We're going to have to change the systems that we live in to get better mental health outcomes. So the other half of that question is, we definitely need to preserve and conserve indigenous psychedelic rituals, practices, traditions, wisdom, all these things. And yet at the same time, with the psychedelic revival and renaissance in the West, we cannot co-opt those and call them our own. It's just not possible, especially because in the United States, we do not have a rich tradition of spirituality. Let's say Mexico, you go back thousands of years to the Olmecs, and they've been practicing this natively here for millennia. We don't have that in the United States, so we have to create something new and novel, maybe take some ideas and take certain aspects from indigenous traditions without claiming them as our own, to use them as kind of guideposts to create our own way to work with these psychedelics and these compounds that is unique to the West and to the United States.
And I've spoken with other psychedelic practitioners, and they seem to be of the volition that any encounters with entheogenic sacraments in the West is beneficial, even if it's in clinical frameworks. Just introducing these ideas is important. It may or must evolve towards this deeper understanding with these mythological, cosmological narratives that pervade indigenous shamanism eventually. But do you agree that any kind of exposure to these entheogenic sacraments, regardless of how they're distributed, is ultimately beneficial? Or
no, I definitely don't think they're beneficial for everyone. Definitely not, especially people with certain mental health conditions. The two worst contraindications in terms of mental health disorders for psychedelics are bipolar and schizophrenia. So anybody with bipolar or schizophrenia should not do psychedelics. So I definitely don't think psychedelics are for everyone. And at the same time, I do believe that psychedelics should not be reduced to, these non-mystical mental health medicines. I think the mystical aspect of it is what provides a lot of the healing, if not most of the healing. And even if not used in that context or that frame, I think there's a definite argument that, one of the reasons that mental health problems are increasing around the world is because we don't have spirituality. A lot of people believe, I know atheists won't like this, but a lot of people believe that human beings are designed to connect with God, source energy, consciousness, the creator, whatever you want to call it. One of the reasons mental health problems are increasing around the world is because we've lost our connection to the creator, to God. As Nietzsche has said, God is dead. Are psychedelics a way to reignite that connection to something that's beyond us? Because once you see that, feel that, experience that you belong to something greater than yourself, you can get through virtually any amount of adversity in your life or any trial and tribulation, as a human being.
I think a lot of the problem in the West is that we anthropomorphize and make God a noun, and we have this constructed image in our mind of this father in the clouds that is this cosmic creator that doles out wishes through prayers or whatever the case may be. But in a lot of mystical spiritual systems, they view God as a verb. The Holy Spirit is just anything that animates and sustains life, has this portion of this divine energy that allows for the evolution of consciousness, the evolution of the physical material realm through generational inheritance or whatever the case may be. And again, I want to go back and I want to agree with you that I don't think psychedelics are for everyone either. I guess the question was more so, do you think that if people find benefit in them in clinical settings, do you think that ultimately it's a net positive for the psychedelic movement? Or do you think without the ritual container, the cosmological container, that it can be a net negative, even if more people are exposed to these sacraments?
Let's say to be determined. I kind of lean towards favoring that it will be a net benefit in the end, because, of course, there's this big debate going on now about, is this psychedelic renaissance, or I call it a psychedelic revival, is it a good thing that it's being commodified and it's entering the capitalist system and, being sold? There's therapies being sold, retreats being sold, and things like this. There's a strong possibility that psychedelics are conscious, right? Terence McKenna talked about this. He talked about mushrooms being conscious. And there's a very good argument for that, because they're half plant, and plants are heliotropic, which some people consider a form of consciousness. So I say that, look, maybe psychedelics, if they're conscious, maybe they have their own agenda that we're not aware of. And maybe they're purposely entering our, economic, financial, capitalist system with plans of their own. And maybe it's like a big Trojan horse. Maybe the therapeutic clinical model is a Trojan horse for psychedelics to achieve greater, bigger goals that we're just not, attuned to and aren't aware of, because psychedelics are very, very unpredictable. They're kind of like the physical incarnation of like a trickster, jokester archetype. And, when you start throwing all these psychedelics into large societies, who knows what's going to happen? And things can change very, very fast, on a dime, both for the worst and for the best. So who knows? Like, the whole world we're living in 10, 20 years from now could be much more beautiful than it is today.
And that unpredictability is important, because I think the ritual context and containers that these initiatic sacraments have had throughout global spiritual history, whether it's the Vedic Soma, the Iranian Hauma, the Kaikion of the Eleusinian mysteries in ancient Greece, they all had a very structured mythological narrative or ritual framework through which these sacraments were distributed. And like you said, the unpredictability without that framework can be a net negative, I think, in this movement more than a positive. So I'm glad you brought that up as well. Writing about psychedelic experiences requires balancing evocative storytelling with psychological grounding. To avoid turning profound or challenging states into trippy content devoid of context, writers must prioritize the aftermath and integration, ground the journey in set and setting, and consciously decline the urge to over-explain every ineffable vision. As someone writing about the sacred and contemporary psychedelic world, how do you decide what to tell, what to leave out, and how to avoid turning powerful experiences into content without context?
That's a tricky question. That's a good one and a tricky one. Yeah, I lean towards not sharing most of my psychedelic experiences. But I don't, there's no hard and fast rules for that. That's just me, because I think there's a definite risk of getting into this spiritual egotism and spiritual one-upmanship, and kind of having a sword fight about, like, I saw a praying mantis, and I saw a cosmic octopus, and all this. So I think there's a risk in doing that. And yeah, I lean towards not sharing and keeping it private, because then I also think there's some trickiness around how sacred are those experiences if you're turning them into content and monetizing them, and so it becomes a really tricky thing. It's important to share those stories sometimes and talk about these experiences, but then, what are they worth if all of a sudden you're commodifying them, monetizing them, and turning them into content? So yeah, I share some, like the one about my synchronicities. I think that's really, really important to share, because it shows the potency of Bufo and the things that can happen afterwards that everybody's not going to be able to deal with when you experience non-duality and reality collapses. So I think that's important to talk about. But some of the other ones, like if I've seen a cosmic octopus or praying mantis, I don't necessarily need to talk about that with people. I keep that to myself and make sure I maintain the sacred quality of that.
I think the mystery is very important across esoteric and entheogenic spiritual systems. This concept of mystery, this ineffable nature of personal experience that only you can have the framework of your memories and your understanding of reality to provide the tools that give you the solution that you're seeking. It's difficult to try to pass that along to another person. or provide the value of the experience in a way that is true to the information that's revealed therein. So I do think
Yeah,
it's
it's
very
so
important.
subjective. I mean, most people can't resonate with a subjective psychedelic experience. They could ooh and ah and be like, oh, yeah, yeah, nod their head. But in the end, it's so subjective. The resonance is going to be very low. And, if there's one lesson that psychedelics can teach all of us, it should be to embrace saying, I don't know.
The Psychedelic Science Conference, hosted by the Multidisciplinary Association for Psychedelic Studies, or MAPS, is the world's largest gathering for psychedelic research and medicine. You may notice the sweatshirt I'm wearing today. I told you that I virtually attended numerous psychedelic conferences in the last few years, including the Psilocybin Conference in 2024, the Psychedelic Buddhism Conference, and Psychedelic Science in 2025. I really do think these conferences are important to bring educators, professionals, people that are just curious, like yourself. It's very important. Intelligence is dictated by curiosity. Asking the right questions is the first step of seeking and then attaining the answers. And I think these conferences really allow for people to immerse themselves in these experiences before having them, not seeing them as fringe topics on the edge of spirituality, but realizing that they're at the heart of this global spiritual history. I really commend you for being at the organization front for a lot of these different conferences and settings that allow for communication across people interested in the space. Global Psychedelic Week in 2025 was the world's first distributed hybrid 7-day conference, running from November 3rd through 9th. It focused on the intersection of psychedelics, mental health, and society. The event included 100 plus speakers and 100 plus local in-person gatherings worldwide. The event was organized by Malika Radovich Mandik. I'm probably butchering that name. Please correct me.
Malitza, like
Malitza.
pizza.
Okay. Malitza and Dennis Walker, a mycologist or micropreneur. The event aims to unite the global community, fostering dialogue on science, therapy, and policy. We have discussed your role in shaping the Psychedelic Global Conference last year. What problem is Global Psychedelic Week trying to solve in the broader movement? And what makes a global distributed format useful for this field?
It's trying to solve access. Dennis and Leitz are awesome and identified a pretty common big problem in this space. Going to these conferences is expensive, man. It's not cheap. There's some smaller conferences, psychedelic conferences and expos that are more affordable, but the big ones like Psychedelic Science, these things cost hundreds and hundreds of dollars. And then you got to fly there, you got to get a hotel, you got to eat out, you're talking, thousands of dollars in the end. So Global Psychedelic Week is able to democratize the space a bit because it's all online. And then anybody in the world can watch it from the comfort of their own home online. And then because of that, the prices for the tickets are much, much cheaper and much more accessible. The broader global distributed format, there's a few benefits to that. One is to realize that this isn't so taboo anymore. And that for those lone psychonauts out there in, let's say, Timbuktu, there's a good chance your next door neighbor is a fellow psychonaut, but you just don't know it yet. So it's a way, again, to create community. And that's the reason that they're having also in conjunction with the online event, the global distributed in real world events as well. I had a real world event here during Global Psychedelic Week last year in Oaxaca and had, like 30 or 40 people turn out for that. And it's a very simple application and sign up process. And, anybody anywhere in the world can have their own little local community meetup. So it's a way to, broaden the movement and bring people together and realize that, that there's more of us out there than we realize.
You mentioned the term psychonaut. I have to give a quick nod to Peter J. Carroll. He popularized the word in Western culture, at least, through his work Psychonaut and Liber Null. He recently passed away, so just want to say a quick rest in peace to him. Moving on to District 216, it's a membership-driven psychedelic social club and community. It functions as an educational hub, a support network, and an advocacy group with the mission of destigmatizing psychedelics, creating safe spaces for open dialogue, and pushing for policy innovation and cognitive liberty. The club actively hosts panel discussions, fireside chats, and expert-led workshops. The goal is to provide a scholarly yet communal approach to understanding how these medicines interact with mental health, addiction, death, and human creativity. What is District 216, and how does it function differently from a standard conference, side event, or branded gathering?
I work with Jacob Tell. Jacob Tell is the founder of District 216. I have yet to attend a District 216 event because it's based in Santa Barbara, California, and I'm down here in Oaxaca. District 216 is a private social club based on psychedelics. So there's a weekly event, I believe every Monday, and then I think there's maybe a monthly event, and then there's larger marquee events, which are every quarter. And so it's another way to build really, really nice community and bring people together that are fellow psychonauts. I kind of got connected to District 216 kind of in a backwards way because last year Jacob Tell and some other colleagues of ours in the space, Christian Gray and Carly Dutch Green, the three of them founded Psychedelic Playhouse, which was a huge mega event at Psychedelic Science in Denver last year. It wasn't affiliated with Psychedelic Science, it was off-site for 2 days, one at Plant Magic Cafe and the other one at Jonas Brothers. And I was there for both of those events, and Psychedelic Playhouse was big, literally and figuratively. It wasn't so big at Plant Magic Cafe because it was a small venue, a few hundred people were there, but Jonas Brothers, a multi-level building. And geez, I think maybe we had upwards of 1,500 people there for that day at Psychedelic Playhouse with speakers, presentations, DJs, big party, lots of fun. So Psychedelic Playhouse is going to happen again next year at Psychedelic Science in Denver again, and we're already working on planning that.
Yeah, you segued perfectly into my next question. I was going to just let people know the Psychedelic Playhouse, produced by District 216, is a prominent immersive event series designed to connect the growing psychedelic ecosystem, featuring artists, professionals, and community members. Held as an off-campus gathering during major conferences like MAPS Psychedelic Science, it serves as a psychedelic playground for education, art, and music, aimed at transforming perspectives and supporting mental wellness. Psychedelic Playhouse sounds playful, but what's the deeper intention behind it, and what kind of conversations or experiences do you want it to make possible?
The deeper intention behind it, I think, is to, simply remove the taboo and the stigma of psychedelics and show the various benefits of them, what we can learn from them, and the different ways that we can use them, and how they enrich our lives and add depth and breadth to our lives. And that this isn't something that we should be keeping like a skeleton in the closet. It's valuable in that regard. And then again, it's a community builder, and not to sound trite or to use too much jargon, but we've been talking, at least in the United States, about community for the last 10 years. And it's something we really, really need. We used to have a lot of community in the United States, and because of the nature of society and what's been going on in the past few decades, we've lost a lot of community. So it's just very, very rewarding to create those kinds of events with people of a like mindset, especially something that's been so stigmatized and demonized and blackballed since the Nixon era. And to be able to bring people together around that and actually celebrate that in public, in the open, without fear of going to jail, that's incredible, and makes that type of event a hell of a drug.
I like the name Psychedelic Playhouse. I was thinking back to the 60s, and you have all these associations with psychedelics, with these fun, smiling hippies, music festivals, these big events where laughter was a normal experience with these sacraments. And then 1970 comes along, 1971, the Controlled Substances Act, Nixon criminalizes all of these. And now we see psychedelics kind of in this scientific framework where you're kind of having to keep this serious modality surrounding these experiences to be taken seriously again. But I think it's also important to realize that these are supposed to be enjoyable experiences while they, like we were talking about Carl Jung, the unconscious, the darkness. Most people can see this as a difficult experience, but through that difficulty, you gain revelations that are very positive. And I think it's important to highlight the fun aspects as well as the serious aspects, and not just lean completely into the serious side of academic scholarship.
This is an awesome point to end on. This is huge. I talk about this a lot, and it feels almost naughty to talk about now because of the things you referred to, the clinical therapeutic model, that you have to be serious. There's nothing serious about psychedelics, taken out of that context. And, I've spent hours laughing at the most ridiculous things while under the influence of psychedelics. And, some of these ayahuasca retreats that I've been to, like I said, when when I have a night that's purging free, I'm laughing, I'm dancing, I'm shaking, I'm shimmying, I'm having a blast. And I've actually had people come up to me and say, oh, like, how could we have the kind of night that you're having? And I said, look, you can do it very easily. There's only 2 rules. The first rule is you're not supposed to talk to anybody in the ceremony, during the ceremony. And the second rule is you're not supposed to touch anybody. Other than that, you can do whatever the heck you want. You can laugh, you could smile, you could sing, you could be ridiculous, be a clown, do whatever you want. I mean, because that is, who said it? It may have been Osho said something about, spirituality is laughter, joy, bliss, happiness. And I think Ram Dass spoke about things like that as well. And man, looking at the world today, or at least, the West and the United States, we need all the joy, bliss, happiness, laughter that we can create. So yeah, I think that's an excellent point to emphasize and to end on, is that psychedelics should be big fun when we choose so.
Beautiful way to end. I just want to thank you again, Adam, for being with me here today. Thank you for your time. Thank you for sharing your experiences. I think they're very valuable. I think people will really benefit from hearing this conversation. Thank you very much for joining me.
Thanks for having me on, Nicholas. Super appreciate it. I had a blast talking with you, and keep up all the fantastic work at S.E.E.K, man. It's really cool. Found you totally by accident and love watching all your content and seeing all your stuff online about esotericism, Gnosticism, and all the awesome work you do over there. So thanks again.
Thank you very much. I appreciate your appreciation, and I look forward to talking again maybe in the coming months. But until then, have a wonderful time, and I'll talk to you then.
Take care, everyone.